So, Sophia Vasilis, the floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So as a short introduction, my name is Sophia Parent. I'm head of policy for production at WWF UK. So I lead the team that works on transition to regenerative dairy, farming policy in the UK, fisheries policy, and trade as well.
Yep. Hi everyone, I'm Vasilis Goumas. I'm an economist at WWF UK. I work a lot on nature positive transition and sectoral transitions, looking at how different sectors need to transition to align with environmental targets. Very nice to be here. I'll pass back to you, Sophia.
Yeah, very nice to be here. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the interest in this piece of research. So I'm going to start presenting the case for regenerative dairy. So this work resulted from a partnership with NatWest, who, as a bank, and as you can imagine, are particularly interested in addressing the financial barriers that farmers face in the transition. So we applied this finance lens to this work, to the case for regenerative dairy. So through the work that we've done, and that includes economic modeling, case studies, documentary films, insights from sector engagement, and compiling a practical guide for farming consultants and finance practitioners. What we hopefully show is that dairy farms that have completed the transition to a regenerative system can be more profitable and are likely to be more resilient to price shocks in inputs, changes in milk prices, but more resilient as well to extreme weather events compared to high input, high output farms. And it's also clear from our research that at the moment, farmers are shouldering most of the risk, but in fairness, this should be distributed more equitably across the supply chain. So it's been a combination of qualitative and quantitative research, and I invite you all to go to the page, scroll down to the bottom of that page. All the reports, case studies, films are there. Watch the films. They're really, really insightful. So today we're going to give you an overview of this work. Our presentation should take 20 to 30 minutes, but what we are looking forward to after the presentation is for your questions, for your reflections. We're also really open to get your feedback on the value of this work in terms of, how it links to other work you're involved in, whether it's policy, whether it's supply chain, whether it's research. We're also very open to your suggestions on things we could have done differently, angles we haven't explored. And because I assume we're all really interested in food system transformation here in this group, we're really open to collaboration with you and the organizations you represent in any future research or other type of work. So let's stay in touch. So starting with a very brief introduction, I'm not taken for granted that you know who WWF is. So for those who don't know, we're an independent conservation organization. We have millions of followers in the UK and across the world, and we have a network of around 100 countries, so a representation in around 100 countries. And our mission is to stop the degradation of the natural environment and to build a future in which people live in harmony with nature. And I haven't been with WWF for too long, but I often get asked, oh, I didn't know WWF worked in food and farming. Why does WWF work on food and farming? So I hope this slide, and I'm sure this is all familiar to you, but these are the reasons. The UK is one of the most nature depleted countries on earth. And I think we all know how our food system is a major driver of nature loss. 70% of the land in the UK is agricultural land. The sector is responsible for 12% of territorial greenhouse gas emissions. And and levels of farm production and livelihoods of farmers are being impacted by the effects of climate change. So if we want to work on addressing the major challenges our planet and our country faces in terms of nature conservation, greenhouse gas emissions, maintaining or achieving nutrition security, we do have to work on food and farming. And you can see some of these very high costs for farmers already. We've done a study that quantified the impact of extreme weather events to Welsh and Scottish farmers in 2018 alone, and this added up to £335 million in things like extra feed costs. And I mean, all these, the agriculture being a driver of nature loss is also true at a global level, and we are a global network. However, farmers are the stewards of the land, and they have the key to the solutions. And we are advocating for the policy solutions that address these barriers for farmers in the transition to regenerative farming. So Vasilis and I both sit in our policy unit, but we work on food and farming in many different ways. So we work on policy solutions, but WWF also works to transform food businesses, and we are working with retailers and buyers to reduce the environmental impact of the UK shopping basket. We track and encourage actions along metrics including climate, deforestation and conversion, diets, agriculture, marine, food waste, packaging, and we do finance advocacy as well and work with finance institutions to unlock the financing for the transition. So what motivated us to undertake this work was observing that farmers have this potential to lead the change towards preserving nature, but there's a significant question mark there around, is this profitable? And acknowledgement of the barriers that stand on their way. So, and this is a bit of contradiction because, of course, farmers want to farm with nature. I mean, there is no food production without nature. But farmers cannot stay in this status quo because the current farming system is unprofitable for many farmers, and it's a very vulnerable business model. And this is what the figures here on the screen highlight. So according to the National Farmers Union, a big proportion of dairy farmers are leaving the business. It was 5% in a year alone between 2022 and 23. And looking towards the future, 33% of dairy farmers are very unsure regarding whether they will stay operational post-2025. And this is obviously a huge problem for farmers themselves, but it also is a huge problem for the UK in terms of food resilience. So our prevalent high input, high output system fails to account for environmental and social costs, and often doesn't provide these consistent financial returns for farmers that enable them to have trust over the long term. And climate change makes weather patterns more unpredictable, and farmers are on the front line of these challenges and very concerned with the impacts that climate change and biodiversity loss are already having on their farms and the ability to produce foods. So the well-being of farmers is also a huge issue, and a survey by Yellow Wellies found that 95% of farmers under 40 agree that mental health is one of the biggest issues the sector faces, and this is due to excessive working hours. Farmers often keep working past retirement age, and as I said before, the huge role land and agriculture have in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and a driver of the poor state our rivers are in terms of their ecological status. So if we move on to the next slide, so through our research, and Vasilis will delve into this in a lot more detail, because he's the economist, is the person with the eye for the numbers, and he's behind the modeling we've done on this, and a lot of the work we've done on this alongside other colleagues that unfortunately cannot be here today. But we will demonstrate how this high input, high output dairy farming has locked many dairy farms in the UK in this low profit business model with limited opportunities to grow and really high exposure to climate and nature related risk. And this graph here just illustrates the volatile environment farmers are operating in. So you can see here a big spike in the cost of fertilizers between 2020 and 2024. And I mean, in the spring, summer of 2022, prices quadrupled for many commonly applied fertilizers. Costs have decreased then, but they're still higher compared to 2020 levels. And I mean, the same is true for other types of input, fertilizer, animal feed, fuel, because they're all associated with the spike in price of fossil fuels following the invasion of Ukraine. And it illustrates the dependency on fossil fuel prices. And if we draw any conclusions from this already, is that inflation in the prices of key inputs decreases the profitability of farmers, as well as their capacity to plan long-term. And this be able to plan long-term is really crucial here in terms of resilience of the supply chain. And the second thing is that we need a new business models that recognizes that farmers need to be resilient to prevent threats to supply chain and investment. So on to regenerative farming and why we apply this lens. We do know this usually triggers some questions. This definition of regenerative farming is still evolving. The term does not require independent verification or certification. However, we approach with this lens because our approach to regenerative farming is we see it as a set of farming principles that foster healthy ecosystems, particularly with soils, rather than relying solely on chemical processes. And practices include things like minimizing soil disturbance, crop diversification, efficient nutrient management, integration of livestock and arable farming, which really focuses on key impacts and addressing key impacts of soil health, water, biodiversity, air quality, and climate. And we also acknowledge the social impact, such as on livelihoods and well-being, placing us on the journey to agroecology. So we see regenerative farming as a kind of a stepping stone towards agroecology. And in the research and in much of what we do at WWF, we try to move away from siloed policy to bring evidence that allows us to think about policy and solutions, keeping in mind that food production relies on a stable nature and a stable climate. And there is no food without nature. I said that before, but this interconnection is what we call the triple challenge, the challenge of meeting our climate, nature, and nutrition security goals. So moving on to the findings, and again, Vasilis will cover this in more detail. But first thing we would like to highlight is that we need a new business model, something that is resilient. And the findings from the case studies and the economic modeling work really well together to demonstrate that we need it and it is possible. So second thing is that changing production styles and practices can create that resilience and profitability that is missing and driving farmers out of business in the dairy sector. But changing practices is not always straightforward. And nature-positive methods of farming that pay more attention to ecosystem health and ecological systems, they're not just about maximizing production sometimes. And returning the farm to having balanced soils takes time. And we will delve into the costs and the time it takes to turn systems around. It's also really important to consider how we measure success, and what are the shift in the incentives that can lead to a profitable regenerative system, and to make sure that the costs are fairly shared across the supply chain. And our findings show that the main barrier for farmers is the financial risk in the form of potentially unpayable debt, but also the changing policy landscape is also a barrier. We've seen a lot of lack of trust in the direction of policy recently. That's not making life any easier for farmers, and inappropriate technical advice can threaten the business viability. The other thing that we highlight through this research is that the agricultural sector can really lead on biodiversity and nature restoration in the UK, create resilience, but also help to meet our environmental targets for nature and climate. And finally, this is why we're here presenting this to you. We need to mainstream these findings and stimulate thinking among different stakeholders and explore how we can alter financial offerings to support dairy farmers to make this transition, particularly in those initial years of transition. And you will hear this fallow period quite a lot in the research. And farmers need this evidence in terms of what works, what doesn't work. And this will be my last slide, and then I'm going to pass on to Vasilis to delve a little bit into what we mean by change in business, in the business model. So many dairy farms in the UK operate this high input, high output model that leaves them exposed to fluctuations in the costs of inputs that I've mentioned before. And we looked across several indicators for farms that completed the transition, not just volume of milk. We look at profitability of typical dairy farms. We also look at the impact of greenhouse gas emissions and nature in that transition. And we looked very more widely in terms of how farms can optimize their resources, whether it's labor or making better use of grass and forage crops. And but we have found this fallow period, which results from it's this initial stage in the transition that can lead to lowered or negative profitability for typical dairy farms. And this is due to investment costs, as well as lower yields outweighing operational savings in the short term. This can be offset by potential rewards from milk price premiums, agri-environment schemes. So we need a varied source of finance to make this viable and profitable. However, there is light at the end of the tunnel, because profitability is expected to recover at the end of this fallow year period. And in many cases, post-transition farms are more profitable. And this is the big barrier for farmers, is the financial risk. And we have articulated in our guidance for farming consultants and finance practitioners sources of funding for the transition, whether it's from public sources, from the supply chain, but also the active role that financial institutions can play here. And we had a good partner in NatWest, and we've been engaging with other banks also throughout this work. And a final thing highlighted in the research is the importance of peer-to-peer farmer exchange networks. And all the farmers in our case studies and in the stakeholder engagement workshops highlighted this as a really powerful source of inspiration and knowledge exchange. So I'm going to pass on to Vasilis now, who will take us through the research in more detail and into that modeling.
Thank you, Sophia. So hi everyone. As Sophia mentioned, we did use different methods to get the answers to this question. One of these methods where we commissioned Cumulus and the Anderson Center to run a cash flow model for us, showing what are the financial costs and benefits that farmers have when they go through a regenerative transition from a high input, high yield system into a regenerative one. But in addition to that, we had sort of case studies of 5 farmers who have actually done this. We had workshops around the country discussing supply chain actors, how they can support farmers. And we have also done additional work on nature and carbon benefits. And so the highlights I'll be presenting now are coming from a combination of these sources. So first of all, resilient and profitable farms. So this is the outcome of our model. There are many messages in this graph, but I'll focus on 2 main ones. So on the left-hand side, we see the farm, a regenerative farm pre-transition, as opposed to at the end of the transition, at the point where they regain profitability. And that's when our model ends. So we stop modeling the costs and benefits at the point where farms regain profitability. It is very likely that these benefits will increase in the future, as a lot of the investments that farmers will make into carbon sequestration or nature benefits are likely to materialize further down the line. So this is one limitation of the model. Secondly, we modeled this for 3 types of farms: fully housed farms, partly grazed, partly housed farms, and finally fully grazed housed, to see how the costs and benefits differ on the type of farm we have. The way we did this model, we collated data from the country, from 100,000 farms, and we use different data sets. So you have data sets from organic farming, data sets from dairy farms, how they're performing, to try and identify what are the impacts of different interventions that farms will take on their cash flow and the profitability of their business. And to give you an example, so what this model shows is, here we have a farm before a transition, and on year 1, as you can see in the blue bars, the revenue drops quite abruptly in the case of fully housed. The reason for this is because we're asking farmers to take a lot of actions simultaneously, cold turkey. This isn't usually how it will happen out in reality. Many farmers would stagger their interventions and introduce them gradually over a period of 10, 20 years. But for the purpose of this model, we did it abruptly. And what these interventions look like, and you can read the detailed list in the documents also related, but what it looks like is changing the breed of cows to one breed that is more resilient to being outdoors, grazing more compatible with less intensive milking regimes. So essentially, a mixed breed cows that are more compatible with this transition. Another one involves more grazing and rotational grazing. So in the case of fully housed farms, we don't think that a fully housed farm can be regenerative, because a big component of regenerative involves soils and grazing. So this includes, if a fully housed farm was to transition to regenerative, this would involve not being fully housed anymore, but having some grazing component in it, more rotations. It involves adjusting breeding periods, the feed that cows are getting, more infrastructure for grazing outdoors, and so on. So these are interventions that farmers introduce in year 1. So 2 key messages from this graph. First, the revenues drop quite abruptly in the beginning of the transition because farmers have to borrow money and invest in all this infrastructure I mentioned earlier to change the breed of cows and so on. The second key message is, the revenues remain lower at the end of the transition than they were in the beginning. The second key message is, if you focus on the lines in the back, so the green line and the purple line, these demonstrate the operational cash flow and the operational profit margin. So these are margins that demonstrate how good the farm is at converting its revenues into cash based on how much cost they have. And we can see that in the case of fully housed farms, at the end of the transition, they become more profitable farms. They're able to retain more of their profits and more of their cash at the end of the transition than they were before. And the reason for this is what Sophia said earlier, that currently dairy farmers rely extensively on fertilizer and external inputs, on fossil fuels, on imported feed, which are very volatile. The prices for those are very volatile and respond to price shocks. And this exposes farmers to a lot of risks and limits their profitability, because very often the revenues are being absorbed by the suppliers of external inputs. This is less the case at the end of the transition, as we can see here. And in fact, we did also, in addition to this, which you can see in the report, we did a sensitivity analysis, which shows that farms at the end of the transition are more resilient to price shocks when it comes to fuel, feed, and fertilizer. Exactly because they rely less on these inputs and they are able to retain more revenue. And this is a message that comes across very clearly also in the case study. So when we interviewed farmers and looked the deep dives into farmers who have done this transition, this is a message that comes across clearly, where at the end, even though they produce less milk, they're able to be more profitable because they have more diversified revenue streams. They're able to receive money from carbon and nature markets. They have minimized their costs to the extent that even though they're producing less, they're able to retain more of the profits. Now, the message is more mixed when we look at the partly grazed, partly housed farm. This is predominantly because there are fewer efficiency gains to be made here by farmers that fall in this category at the end of the transition. So again, we have a similar image of revenues dropping when the transition starts, especially, and these are the worst periods in both cases are years 1 to 4 when they have to borrow extensively a lot of money. And then at the end of the transition, we see that the operational cash flow margin as well as the operational profit margin are not much lower. In the case of the operational cash flow margin, it's actually lower. In the case of the operational profit margin, it's like a bit higher. So this, I think, shows that there are quite some. We need to be quite adaptable with how we support different types of farmers. And I think a key message here is to the point that Sophia made earlier, is that we are asking farmers to take up a lot of risk. If farmers have to provide the carbon sequestration required, the nature benefits that we need as society and as policymakers, and if we want them to become more profitable businesses at the end of this transition, there is a lot of support that needs to come between the years 1 to 4, and this comes in the form of grants or in the form of subsidies or payments for ecosystem services, as well as rewarding these actions through the supply chains, whether it is providing longer contracts, whether it is providing more price premiums for this service that they'll be providing. The picture is similar for if you look at fully grazed farms, it's more closer to the fully housed one, but I won't get into this now in detail. So this is the second key message that I'll be presenting on. It's on distributing cost and risk. And my background is I've done some research on energy markets before, and I think what we see, if you look at the cash flow of regenerative farms, it's quite similar to a cash flow of some of the renewable energy projects you might see, where in order to invest in this transition to regenerative farming, there is a lot of upfront investment that needs to be made. And then there is limited revenue for the first few years, similar with renewable energy. If you build like a wind turbine, you have to invest a lot of money up front, and the turbine won't be producing much until it's actually constructed. But then when it's actually producing, you have this income coming in and the cash flow improves at the end of it. The difference is that, with renewable energy, we've had the right policies and supply chain interventions in place to account for this reality, where we have, for instance, governments providing feed-in tariffs or providing specific renewable obligation payments to companies that construct those. You have purchasing agreements where big users of energy agreeing to pay money to the energy generation company and that they agree that they will be buying their energy, which then gives confidence to financial institutions to invest in this renewable energy project because they know that there is a market in place and that the energy will be bought at the end of it. We don't have this infrastructure yet for regenerative agriculture, where there are some nascent markets where farmers will receive a premium if they follow some of these interventions that are compatible with the regenerative transition, but these are quite small, like very small proportion of farmers have access to those. But increasingly, we are seeing different supply chain actors providing the support we would like to see in the future. So what we mean by support, we mean providing longer-term contracts to dairy farmers that agree to invest in these interventions. We mean providing price premiums as well to reward them for doing this. And this can come from processors and retailers respectively. And I think having this in place and knowing that there's a market for this will give them financial institutions confidence to provide financing to these farmers because they know that there'll be more resilient farms and because the profitability looks better at the end of the transition than it did initially. And they can do so, for instance, at a discount because this also helps banks reduce the amount of emissions they finance. And so this is sort of the change we like to see here. We like to see different supply chain actors shouldering the risk, which is currently falling almost exclusively for farmers, because we are aware that we're asking a lot of farmers to do. This is a big leap of faith to invest in a transition that involves them changing their business model without knowing what the outcomes will be. So we did this analysis, the financial model, but then we're curious. We thought, okay, so you do this, we see what the impact on cash flow is. What is the actual impact on carbon emissions and biodiversity on a farm level? So we commissioned the Farming Carbon Toolkit, who assessed using the exact same assumptions we used for modeling the costs of the farm transitions to see what amount of carbon emissions would such a farm produce. And it is quite positive because overall, a farm that has transition produces less emissions. And this is largely due to the decrease in the number of animals that they have, because now we have increased grazing, so there's decrease in animals and emissions drop. But it is quite, the results are quite positive as well if you look at emissions per hectare or per milk. That there is encouragement here that I think this transition can help achieve carbon emission targets. And on nature implications, I think it's very clear that there's lower pollution of water and soil. There is much better management of slurry and nitrogen pollution, enhanced water retention because soils are much more productive and store much more carbon and nutrients, and you have higher pollinator abundance, which you can see later. Now, the fifth element, the fifth key message is about spreading the words on this. So we've done a series of reports, which I'm just showing now the links here in the chat as well, where we try to communicate these findings quite clearly, both to farmers, both to supply chain actors, to financial institutions, and so on. And I think I really encourage. What's interesting is when we first finished the model, we realized that there was no farmer out there that this model represented, which I think is true of any model. Like every farmer we met did it differently, even to each other or to our model. So I think it's really interesting in looking at the findings of the model and how we model the transition at a national level. So we're trying to get general messages of what would it cost to transition, and is there a light at the end of the tunnel? But then if you look at these results in parallel to the work we've done with farmers in the case studies, it's really interesting to see how farmers do it differently and how they adapt what we modeled into their own farms and how they do things differently, and so how the transition is more tailored to the needs of their own farms. So we're doing a lot of engagement and workshops with supply chain actors and farmers to ensure that these messages get across, but also that we improve our own methods and we advocate for the correct things and changes. Sixth and final is, this is a lot of information across multiple reports. So what we've done is we summarize all of it. So we summarize the financial model results, we summarize the carbon emissions and nature impacts, the case studies of farms doing it into a guide report. So this is a QR code that will take you to this guidance report, which is a short document which summarizes what does the transition look like, what are the key terms, what would you expect the cash flow impact to be if a farm was to invest in this, what would the cash flow impact be? And this is important because currently bankers and loan managers and relation managers, they don't know what regenerative farming is. So this is an attempt to sort of upskill them, because if they receive an application from a farmer who wants to invest in this regenerative transition, they can refer to our guidance and see what is the approximate impact of a transition on the cash flow of the farm, and they compare it to the application they receive from the farmer to transition. But it's also useful for practitioners such as agricultural consultants who may want to cross-reference what they think a transition for regenerative agriculture looks like based on the results of our model and the case studies we've done with farmers. So if you don't have time to go into the model or we deep dive into the case studies, I think this is a very good summary of our work overall. So this is overall the presentation. Very keen to hear your thoughts. I think we have enough time for your questions. Our next steps is, I think our plan is to use this work to influence different processes going on in the country. Some of them involve engaging supply chain actors and sort of incentivizing them to do more action. And there's already a lot of it happening out there. So for instance, First Milk are working with Nestle to provide these price premiums for farmers that invest in regenerative agriculture. We have examples of some retailers also providing better contracts and price premiums to farmers that invest in this, but we need to see more of this, and we do need see this cooperation quite well across the supply chain. And I think this is where we see our role as WWF is in aligning the actors and sort of creating these partnerships out there to support farmers to transition. But additionally, we're trying to influence policy processes in the right direction so that whatever the government does of SFI or other incentives they'll develop for farmers, we want to make sure that they are fit for purpose. And I think our research highlights quite well what the financing gaps are. So we're hoping to highlight these, and so that then we can use SFI to plug in directly these gaps that farmers are currently facing in a way that can accelerate their transition, but also can crowd in private investment. So this from mine. I'll pass over to you, Sophia, in case anything else you want to add or next steps.
No, I think now it's up to the participants. We're really open to your observations, to your questions. Yeah, any things we should have done differently, any reflections. We're really open to your suggestions.
Thank you very much, Sophia and Vasilis, for a very interesting talk. Maybe if you can stop sharing. Oh, great. Thank you very much. So we have a question in the chat. Did all farmers change all the same practices and inputs during transition? And if so, what was the most common changes in transition?
Do I go, Sophia? Yeah, so good question. I'll show in a minute also the links from the videos we did, because we did a series of films summarizing these case studies of with farmers, which are very interesting. I think before I answer directly the question here, I think it's something important to mention is that each farmer has had a different starting point. So for instance, a couple of the farmers out of the 5 case studies we have decided to started from an organic viewpoint. So they first transitioned towards organic dairy, and then they sort of continued this transition and moved on to more agroecology and regenerative agriculture. Other farmers that we have just noticed that's another 2 out of the 5 case studies, noticed that they really struggle with being profitable, that they were locked into a system and that they were being overworked and they didn't have enough family time. So this transition towards regenerative agriculture for them was a way of optimizing their operations to retain more of the profits, but also to gain more time. And the reason this is relevant here is because every farmer decided to start with something different. One key message that comes across from all 5 case studies is that there's a lot of experimentations involved, and most farmers recommend you don't introduce all the interventions at once, as we've done in our model, but instead you progressively introduce them and see what the impact is, and then pile on as the years go by, which is why often the transition would take 10 or 20 years rather than the 7 years that we modeled. Now, in our case, in our model, based on the work we did with Cumulus and the Anderson Center, I think a very key part of the transition is changing the breed of cows you have, especially if the breed of cows are like, let's say, Heifers, who spend a lot of time indoors, are sort of being milked very intensively. I think changing to mixed breed cows was a big part of the transition, and it's actually the reason why this transition takes 7 years, because in our model we assume that farmers start breeding these mixed breed head of cows from 0 and then pile on. But some of the farmers we met, they didn't do it this way. They just sold their cows and bought new ones, essentially. But so they did it much quicker. But I think this is a key component of the transition. And the second key component is more grazing. So essentially increasing the amount of time that cows spend outdoors. This helps not only bring in the benefits of having cows on the field and grazing for soil fertility and then for how the soil functions, but it also helps with so reducing the use of external inputs and then sort of managing waste and slurry, which is very often increasing the costs that farms are facing.
Thank you very much. And there is a follow-up question. In your figures, do you also record a reduction in fertilizer use?
Yeah, yeah, we do. So if you go to the modeling report, I think a lot of the assumptions are outlined there, which we say how much we expect fertilizer use to change under the transition. It is, when we measured the impacts on nature, pollutants such as phosphates or nitrates was something we tried to capture, but it's really hard to to measure them accurately, what the decrease in nitrogen pollution would be. So if you're looking at the impacts on nature, then the nitrates, it's not very clear. But if you're looking at the reduction in nitrogen fertilizer use, that's very clearly, the assumptions are very open there on how much we think with Cumulus and the Anderson Center, how much nitrogen fertilizer use would decrease. And this is what largely drives the decrease in the costs of farms.
Thank you very much.
I would say reduction in external inputs has been a really important and a major objective for the farmers that we interviewed in the case studies, reducing that dependency, making better use of the resources the farm has, and make best use of grass as a cheap input, has been like a main motivation. And then in terms of like the practices we modeled, and we've also studied in terms of not just looking at cash flow and investment, but impacts in terms of carbon emissions and nature. Yes, that has been done comprehensively, like Vasilis covered, but and you will see in the reports and in the guidance, but we looked at rotational and increased grazing, reduction in important feed fertilizers, improved soil health, lower stocking rates, trees and hedges, which are very much in line with regenerative practices like we see in the literature.
Thank you very much. Now, there are no more questions in the chat, so anyone would like to ask the question directly? If you can please raise your hand.
If that's the case, Philippa, then I'm very happy to hear your thoughts on, like, if you end up looking into it, I'm very happy to hear your thoughts on whether it's realistic what we modeled and whether it is something that is reflected in your research, this reduction. Because, you know, it's hard, as probably many of you know in this room, it's very hard to model a transition on a national level, because each farm is located in a different area, has different needs, different sizes. So, you know, by trying to capture this on a national level, you know, we are quite crude. So it'd be very interesting to get a sense from you on whether we've done this well, and which is why I think the case studies are really valuable, because they help us sense check this, because we actually look at farms who of different sizes and different areas of the country who have actually done this transition.
We have another question. Did you make any observation as to whether there were any changes in welfare of the dairy cattle? So the impact on cattle here.
It wasn't something that we're directly looking to capture. However, it did come up in both the case studies we did, that welfare of animals improves, and was also the main reason why we decided not to model the transition of a fully housed farm, so a farm where cows spend most of the time indoors. We believe that you cannot have a regenerative farm that's like this. And a big reason for this, after talking to different companies that are processing milk and are investing in regenerative, they said that, you know, the customers, when they imagine regenerative farming, they don't imagine cows spending their entire life indoors. So I think this movement towards regenerative agriculture involves cows grazing more time and being more outdoors, being milked 2 or 3 times a day instead of 4. So indirectly, the assumptions we took for regenerative transition to regenerative agriculture also equate the well-being benefits, so welfare benefits for animals. And an anecdote here, which I think if my colleague May was here, because she spent a lot of time in farms, was a big milk processor in the UK. They transitioned some of the farms to regenerative agriculture, and in one of their farms, they had to actually train the cows and teach them how to graze, because they spend their entire life indoors, and they suddenly went outside and they were hitting the ground too aggressively, so that their nose would bleed and they didn't know how to graze. So I think this is it's in my mind, not having spent a lot of time on farms, it's a crazy example of why you need this transition.
Yeah, what I would add is we haven't measured changes to animal welfare, as Vasilis said, but through the case studies, some of those benefits for animal welfare came through the experience of farmers, and it's derived from changes in breeds of cows, but also so these breeds are more robust. They're meant to be out grazing in the fields rather than indoors. The pressure in terms of the milking regime is also alleviated. They can see changes and benefits for animal welfare as well.
Great. And following on from the animal welfare to the farmers' mental health during the transition. What changes did you observe in farmers' mental health during the transition for such a big, high, risk process, and mental health being something you identify so important? So were you able to sort of focus on this as well?
We can both say something to that point. Again, this came through the case studies, and I invite you all to read those case studies, to see the films, because that's illustrated beautifully by the farmers themselves. But this came through in the case studies, but also in the stakeholder workshops that we've done in England and Wales. And I think there's two elements to this. One is that relying more on the resources of the farm and relying less on external inputs that are often volatile in terms of prices, it makes a huge difference in the new business model. One thing Vasilis alluded to is the milking regimes, and we know how dairy farmers are suffering probably more than other types of farms with mental health pressures because of the pressures around milking times and the lack of flexibility that arises from that, with having to wake up at 3 or 4 a.m., having to go to bed so early. It impacts a lot on mental health. And at least one of the farmers went from a very intensive milking regime to milking once a day. And that had a huge impact just in the ability of spending more time with the family. That kind of paid for the transition itself, that having more time to spend with the family, dedicating himself to diversifying sources of income for the farm, etc. And the other point I would like to make is that the huge importance of peer-to-peer farming exchange, because that's a big source of motivation and trust. Farmers really trust other farmers, and a lot of them were motivated to change by having plugged into an existing local group with a lot of knowledge about grazing systems, and that built the trust that change was possible, and support was at hand, and again that had a big impact on mental health as well.
Anything to add, Vasilis? That's great. Thank you very much. So we have a few more minutes left. Are there any questions? Burning questions that you would like to ask? Can I ask in a meantime? Obviously, you focus on sort of UK and the work here. Were you able to maybe compare it to some sort of other examples across Europe in your work?
I think there are. I think the Dutch and the Danish have a few examples of this. I think Arla is quite active in Denmark, and there are many regenerative initiatives in Netherlands as well. I think something that we see recurring a lot, because we had a lot of discussions with colleagues in our network who work in these countries, is that I think farming is very difficult at the moment, especially in the last few years. Now, milk prices have increased now, but there was a moment 2 years ago where they plummeted and it was really hard for farmers. And I think there is a big movement to find ways to make farms more profitable. And I think this is why I see this regenerative agriculture feeding in all these 3 countries, where we are in the process of establishing new revenue streams for farmers, whether it is through nature and carbon. We are in the process of optimizing the performance of farms. And I think regenerative agriculture fits in this space really well. And this is something that surprised me with this outcome. I thought when we modeled the costs of the transition, I thought at the end of it, we'll be advocating for support for farmers. Whereas instead, what we realized is that there are a lot of benefits that come with optimizing the performance of farms that are major there. So our message suddenly became, okay, this is not just about nature and climate. This is actually about retaining more of the profits on farm level. But yeah, I cannot say much more on the work that the Dutch and the Danish have done. But I think early on, when we were looking at the assumptions of our model, we looked at some of the work they've done.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And then we have another question in the chat. What are your long-term goals within the country and even outside? It's quite a complex.
It's quite a complex question. I'm happy to have a go, and Vasilis, do come in as well. So just alluding to the level of interest that we're seeing at the moment around regenerative farming from different angles. Soil health, reduction in emissions, but also profitability for farmers. There's a huge interest at the moment. There is a review commissioned by DEFRA on the profitability of farmers at the moment. And we think studies like this can be really insightful for that kind of a review, because this affects our ability to produce food in this country. If we don't have farmers in business, we can't maintain the levels of production. We'll have to import more. We live in an increasingly unstable climate. There's trade wars going on. The price of inputs fluctuates. We're just one war away from things collapsing. Plus, we have to adapt to the effects of climate change. So from small farmers to big corporations, we've seen an explosion in interest around regenerative farming as a more sustainable model. So, and as an organization whose mission is conserving nature, we're really interested in that nexus and in this solution. We know there's at the moment a lack of common frameworks around regenerative farming. We're very much aware of that, but there's also a lot of movement and organizations actually trying to come up with that common framework. I would just mention the British Ecological Society have done a very helpful review on regenerative farming, very helpfully setting up the objectives, principles, and practices, and that's quite helpful to untangle all of this. And the British Standards Institute has also done a white paper with recommendations for developing best practice and conducting a review of informal standards that are currently abundant, and provide monitoring, reporting, and verifiable support so that we end up with a harmonized framework and consistent, that then provides confidence and consistency across the sector.
Thank you very much. And probably the last question really is, in the egg world, a few big processors only using free-range eggs, for instance, Hellmann's, made a huge difference in confidence for free-range eggs producers. Have you got any large processors likely to step into the role of regenerative dairy?
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's why in the UK we have a very big proportion of free-range eggs, and this is quite unique even in Europe because of the buy-in from the industry, and it just highlights the role industry has to play. So I think Vasilis already alluded to some examples of processes that are already paying and rewarding farmers for regenerative practices. So First Milk is one that comes immediately to mind. Some retailers are starting to come up with those reward mechanisms for farmers that pay a tiered premium according to how many practices they have on farm. I don't know, Vasilis, if you know, like by heart some of those initiatives, but I think these are the ones that come to mind. But yeah, I agree that we need like cross industry buy-in, and maybe a similar mechanism of industry coming together to push for change at scale, because that's what we need. We can't just leave this in the hands of farmers, because They, as we covered, they take a lot of the risk in the transition. So this needs to be shared across the supply chain.
Yeah, I agree, Sophia. And I think what is like a limitation with regenerative is that, you know, the definition is still being developed. So, and I think there is quite a consensus in the farming community, and that, you know, we want to avoid regenerative becoming something too prescriptive the way that organic is, because it'll be very hard to grow this market if that's the case. But at the same time, you don't want to create a term that means nothing, like essentially everyone and anything can be regenerative. And the reason this is an issue, because for farmers, I think, to introduce enough of the interventions that we have suggested in our modeling, the level of investment is quite significant. And I think that's why, even though we have examples of, let's say, cooperatives such as Your Valley, Arla, or First Milk that are giving farmers these benefits, if they follow some regenerative practices, I think this has to be scaled up a lot, and the amount of finance available needs to increase for farmers to actually believe in the transition at a scale that is meaningful. So I don't know how this compares to eggs, but the investment looks massive for dairy. It's very big.
Thank you very much. And we close with Annie's question here, because I'm aware of the time. So with the reduction in milk yield in the regenerative model you found, where would the deficit be made up from? Yeah,
also a very big question. And as an organization, our production policy work is very closely aligned to what we call for in terms of change in diets. Because as a country, and this is increasingly the case across the world, our diets are heavily reliant on meat and dairy, and that's not good for our health, and that's not good for the health of our planet, because these sectors have a very high environmental impact. So we do think that in tandem with the transition to more regenerative models, that kind of, because at the moment we're externalizing a lot of the environmental impacts of this type of production, the high input, high output system. We import a lot of feed. So if we were just using land in the UK, our land wouldn't be sufficient to support this kind of systems. So it's not that it's efficient from that point of view. So we think this transition needs to be done in tandem with a transition in our diets towards less and better meat and dairy.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for a very interesting talk and quite thought-provoking discussion. So thanks a lot. I mean, there are some remarks at the end, so we won't delve into it now because unfortunately we do not have the time. The recording will be posted on our YouTube, and hopefully people will be able to, obviously, through the links, find more about the work that you're doing. But Sophia and Vasilis, thanks a lot. And the rest of you will see you at our next seminar, which is on the 12th of June. Please follow the CCRI website.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And we could do another webinar on
oh, definitely. We can.
And